Hello, everybody, and welcome. We're just going to give folks a couple of minutes to come on into the room, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right. Welcome to today's community conversation. The future is Neurospicy, embracing diverse minds and voices. I'm Sasha Sensor. I'm the Director of Education at Anchor, and I'm also a very proud, twice exceptional autistic human being. I've been happily married for nearly 18 years, have close friends across the country, many for over a decade, and talk to my parents who've been happily married for 50 years every few days. Just last year, they even flew to Santa Fe. So if you were at conference, many of you had an opportunity to meet them in person. I've also completed 4 degree programs, including a JD from the University of Miami School of Law, and built 3 successful careers across 3 different industries. So if you know, you know. Why I'm exceptionally excited today about our conversation about a future where neurodiversity is neurospicy and where everyone's strengths, stories, and voices belong. Today, we're here to dive into a conversation about neurodiversity, not as a medical term, but as an identity, as a community, and a movement. Neurodiversity challenges how we see the world, especially when it comes to people whose brains function in ways that are often considered outside the norm. Today, we're also going to explore neurodivergence as a critical part of human diversity and ask the big questions. How do we honor neurodiversity as an identity within the broader conversation about inclusion? What are the intersections and divergences between neurodivergence and IDD? And how do we create inclusive, supportive communities that honor all types of bodies and minds? Neurodivergent individuals are often marginalized, misunderstood, and placed outside the mainstream. But this conversation is not just for professionals in the disability sector. It's for anyone who's interested in building more inclusive, people centered spaces that recognize the inherent value of diverse minds. We will also take a hard look at how, even when the context of inclusion, neurodiverse and neurodivergent identities still face unique barriers, and why these barriers must be broken down for everyone to thrive. So today's conversation is about embracing neurodivergence as a strength and rethinking our approach to inclusion. And our panelists will guide us through these explorations and share insights from their very own lived experiences. But before we jump into all of this fun conversation, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to take care of. This session will be recorded, and the recording, along with any other additional materials from our speakers, will be available on the Anchor Connected community next week. So don't worry if you need to step away, we've got you covered, or if you signed up and can't be here, we'll welcome you back whenever it is possible. We also have live Zoom captions available for you. To turn them on, click the More button in the bottom right of your screen and select Enable Captions, or select the function that shows the traditional CC. Please be aware that this is AI-generated software, and sometimes it can be a little off. We appreciate your understanding as we work with the best tools available to us at this time. We want your questions. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll have time to address those questions towards the end of the session. Please note, however, we encourage questions that promote deeper reflection and insights. So if you can Google it, please don't ask it. I'm sure you can find the answers pretty quickly through your search engine. And also, we can't see you, but you can see us. So if you really feel excited about something we're saying, or you want to show your love and support, please feel free to use all of the react buttons that are down at the bottom. This is a vulnerable space for many of us, and your love and support as we go through is always helpful in giving us the confidence to speak our truth. All right. So with all of that being said, let's begin with the introductions we have today. first, I'd love to introduce you to Jean. Jean, could you share a bit about your background and why you believe this conversation about neurodivergence as an identity is so important?
Well, thank you, Sasha. Also, thank you, Janelle and Heather, for joining together in this conversation. For all of you that joined, thanks for taking the time. I'm Gene Boes. I'm the president and CEO of Northwest Center. We're an organization that was started in 60 years ago in Seattle by four moms that were told their children didn't belong in school or church or the community and should be put in institutions. And those four moms rightly stood up and said, our children have the right to an education and to be included in society. And they helped author legislation in Washington State and then national legislation. So those moms impacted every zip code. And for me, that's the aspiration that we have at Northwest Center, is to have that same impact across the country. Our commitment is to supporting the disability community broadly and making sure that they're allowed to engage and contribute, because all of us need the opportunity to be contributing citizens. For me personally, why am I here? It's more about me as a parent. Honestly, I'm the parent of an adult daughter that's on the severe end of the autism spectrum. I'm also the spouse of a wife with a disability. My wife has Parkinson's. I was also the son of a father who had late onset multiple sclerosis. So I've seen how the world excludes people, and it's incredibly important to me that we include people. And why is this conversation so important? For me, it's that all of us need to be really well informed. I love that knowing that this audience already is well informed, you're going to become more informed. And the way that we're most effective are changing minds and hearts. The truth is, we all need to be allowed to engage and contribute for all of us to reach our potential. And so this conversation is incredibly important, because this is how I'll come away more informed and more equipped to help, again, change those minds and hearts of people that need to better understand this topic.
Thanks, Jean. Heather, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Can you introduce yourself and share why understanding neurodivergence as an identity is so critical in the broader conversation about inclusion?
Sure. So my name is Heather Jancy, and I'm an executive consultant and subject matter expert for an agency called Setworks. And I am also a neurodivergent adult. I was not diagnosed until I was in my 30s. And I often look at the world through a different lens, having not really understood a lot of things about myself and the way that I learned. And this particular topic really rides home in terms of inclusivity. I often, relate to a quote about the difference between being asked to prom, but also being asked to dance, right? We want to be invited into a world that isn't necessarily designed for us. In terms of social acceptance and also in terms of access to services and true advocacy. And so, as I have become more self-actualized and understanding things that are uniquely wonderful about myself and gaining access to services to make sure that I am successful, I've also become a parent to 5 adopted children who are also neurodiverse and have a wide variety of categorical need. And so it's important for me, as someone who identifies as neurospicy and also has spent nearly 20 years in the IDD services field, and now also raising children who have a variety of different needs, to make sure that we are continuing to expand on true inclusivity, to make sure that we are not necessarily being asked to be in the same room, but we are invited to have value and to provide value into all the spaces that we are in.
Thank you, Heather. Janelle, can you share your perspective on why this conversation about neurodivergence as an identity is especially important in today's inclusive world? And by the way, welcome back. It's a joy to have you for your second community conversation with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Y'all know I love Anchor, so I'm glad to be back. I am especially excited to be on this panel with Jean and Heather. We're going to have fun today. Thank you, Sasha, for inviting me for this. So I'll introduce myself. I'm Janelle Johnson, licensed marriage and family therapist supervisor. I'm founder and co-owner of Bridges Family Life Center. We are a therapy practice and also a training and consulting practice. And among other things, I also am a PhD candidate and researcher at NC State, where I'm studying the intersection of race and autism and neurodivergence. And so I've been doing that for the last 4 or 5 years. So on the personal front, why this is important to me. I am an autistic human, multiply neurodivergent, multiply disabled. As a therapist, I've been working with neurodivergent humans for the past 13 years, and I'm parent to an autistic, multiply neurodivergent and disabled kiddo. I'm married to a neurodivergent person. Family, y'all know how these genetics work with this thing. So it's kind of been my world and my life, even though I wasn't diagnosed until adulthood, much like Heather shared. I got diagnosed about 7 or 8 years ago. So the timeliness of this is most of the people on this call probably know this, but the timeliness of this conversation couldn't be better. Just during the past week, we have seen a lot of how do I put this? We've seen a lot of pushback, a lot of pseudoscience, um, comments that are inflammatory and degrading and demeaning to the autistic community. And so I'm really happy to be a part of this conversation to present a different view, but also help us to think more broadly about how we can support our autistic and neurodivergent colleagues and those that have higher support needs that we may be serving or our organizations may be serving.
Well, I appreciate you all being here. And this is a little bit of my moment where I get to go back into another career as a teacher. We're going to set up some grounding vocabulary today, just to give some of you an insight about what these words mean academically, but also what they mean in common parlance, because they're not always the same thing. So first of all, let's take a look at the term neurodiversity. So the term neurodiversity was first theorized and published in 1998 as part of a sociology honors thesis presented to the University of Technology, Sydney, by Judy Singer, who identified as being the middle of 3 generations of women on the autistic spectrum. This thesis was based on her participant observation of online e-groups within the autistic self-advocacy movement, and she used the term neurodiversity to describe the idea that neurological differences are normal and valuable aspects of human variation. Thus, like all things, there is controversy around who used this term first, how it's used in Judy herself. But this is at the moment the standard collected recognition. If you want to deep dive into something, go ahead and explore that on your own. However, it was really our understanding that her work gained wider attention in 1998 when The Atlantic published an article about neurodiversity. And today, the term represents a very powerful call to recognize, respect, and include all kinds of minds, not as broken, but as different and valuable. So when we think of neurodiversity, it's really that there are neurological differences, they are natural, they are valuable, and there ain't nothing broken with those of us who have those differences. All right, so that leads us to the term neurodiverse. So the term neurodiverse really grew out of the neurodiversity movement that started in the late 1990s and into the early 2000s. So while Singer is accredited in many ways with coining the term neurodiversity, it's really advocates and online communities that began using the term neurodiverse as a way to describe groups that include a mix of different types of brains: autistic, ADHD, dyslexic, neurotypical, and more. So technically, neurodiverse should be used for groups, not individuals, just like a group can be diverse, but a single person is not diverse because there's no comparative value, right? For individuals, neurodivergent is more accurate, but you'll often hear people say, I'm neurodiverse. This evolution in language really just reflects the continued push for better ways to honor and describe the full spectrum of human brains. So with that in mind, that's neurodiverse. So what then is neurodivergent? So neurodivergent was a term that was first coined in 2000 by a Polynesian activist, Kasiane Asa Asasumase. I've never heard it pronounced out loud for myself, so I'm doing the best I can. If you know a better pronunciation, please let me know. We will honor that as we go through. So while neurodiversity describes the broad idea that different types of brains are part of human diversity, neurodivergent gives us a word for individuals whose brains work differently from the mainstream. So people who are autistic, ADHD, dyslexic, or otherwise outside of the neurological majority. The word caught on in advocacy circles because it puts the focus on difference, not deficit. So it puts the focus on differences and not deficits, and has become central to the conversation about inclusion and identity. And so the last piece of vocabulary we want to introduce today is maybe a term some of you might have heard, which is neurospicy. So neurospicy, it's a cheeky, self-descriptive label that many in the neurodivergent community have embraced. It's a way to say my brain operates a bit differently, but that's part of my unique flavor as a human being. To that end, for some, neurospicy feels more approachable than clinical terms, and I think a lot of us can understand that. It's a way to acknowledge neurodivergence with a wink and a nod and without having to dive into medical jargon. And it's especially popular among folks who are still kind of exploring what this identity means to them as they go through life. But like any term, it's not without its complexities. Some feel that neurospicy might gloss over the real challenges that come with neurodivergence. Others point out that the term could unintentionally echo some cultural stereotypes, especially when spicy has been used in less than flattering ways, in particular to describe women of color. So at the end of the day, language is personal. And the beauty of our diverse minds is that there's room for all kinds of expressions and flavor. And I love the person who just put out there that I'm neurojiggy. Like, there you go. We create our own lexicon as we get into the space. So we felt like those four terms were probably things we needed to level set and provide a broader introduction to. And with that out of the way and all of us on the same page, we're going to get into the deeper conversation. So our first question's going to go to Heather. Heather, could you explain the distinction now that we've talked about neurodivergent and neurodiversity between IDD and neurodivergence and how these two concepts intersect?
Absolutely. So having been a person who has spent their entire career under the umbrella of IDD, this was a particularly wonderful piece of this presentation for me to be able to focus on. IDD is reflective of intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so we're really creating an umbrella that helps us describe a group of conditions that are usually connected to some sort of deficit, whether they be physical, language, or behavioral barriers. So these are types of things that are usually connected to a higher level of categorical need because they are developmental or cognitively impairment. You're going to see these things have an intersectionality with neurodiversity in a variety of different ways, just depending on how people self-actualize or identify. But when you're looking specifically at the IDD world, we're really thinking of things in more broader categories. So autism spectrum disorder, Down syndrome, fetal alcohol syndrome, and these are often indicators or categories that we use in order to gain access to services or create a level of eligibility. When we're looking at this from a neurodivergence standpoint, this is more identity affirming. This is more creating a sense of community. It's more social. It's more descriptive of the different functions or spectrum of brain development and how we operate as being neurodiverse. And then also creating an intersection between whether we are neurodivergent or if we are considered to be neurotypical. Again, a lot of these communities are going to be born out of people who identify identify as autistic or ADHD, dyslexia, but there is not necessarily always a cognitive or developmental condition that is also merging with the neurodivergence. And again, a lot of this is directly related to the different types of services that we receive and whether or not we need to have more of a clinical diagnosis in order to gain access to different types of things that would support us and whether or not we're looking for a sense of community. So essentially, like a person with autism spectrum disorder might be considered both neurodivergent and also developmentally disabled. But someone who is intellectually disabled may also identify as being neurodivergent. So it's not necessarily an all or nothing concept, but making sure that we're understanding that not all neurodivergent people have IDD, and not all people who are IDD or identify as an IDD are neurodivergent. And so it's just a matter of being able to understand that there's a difference between developing a sense of community and also having the key components of understanding to make sure we understand what we need as people to ensure that we're gaining access to the right services. So again, like for someone like myself, I have inherently been neurodiverse my entire life, having not really known so. And again, having never been diagnosed into adulthood, and this is very common of women, we are often seen as great multitaskers. We are often seen as having high levels of energy. I'm sure that my loved ones would describe me as quirky or particular. And so again, I've always known these things about myself. I've always felt different than other people, but never really had a name for it. And I really found my community as I got older in being a part of IDD services because again, there was a sense of community unknowingly because I was working with people and working in conjunction with individuals who really belonged to the same community that I wasn't even aware that I belonged to. And now as a parent to children who are, who have intellectual and developmental disabilities and who are also neurospicy, it really is, again, creating not only a sense of categorical need in order to gain access to services, but it's also creating a sense of community and making sure that we all have a place at the table, if you will. And so, as we continue to think about the different types of need, it's also really important that we are categorized or diagnosed appropriately to ensure that we are gaining access to the right types of services. Because depending on whether or not we fall under the IDD or neurodiverse categories, well, really is reflective of the types of supports that are available to us. Because oftentimes we're not gaining access to things through insurance companies or things like Medicaid or all of the wonderful services that like providers like Jean provide, unless we have a clinical diagnosis, unless we have a primary diagnosis of being IDD. And so again, those different types of things are more qualifiers than kind of the end of the line, and just making sure that we're being able to navigate this sea of potential opportunity. I have a huge love of being able to make sure that the world that we live in is accessible, and not only from the different types of services, but also looking at that from a racial and socioeconomic background. This is something that Janelle will also touch on as well. But we want to make sure that we are creating an inclusive world for all people who have a variety of spectrum of need, and that they are not only offered to people who have great insurance or who do not live in poverty or who are not, people of color, or people who are not LGBTQ or identify as queer. We want to create this entire world where, regardless of if you are IDD or neurodivergent or both or neither, that we have the resources in order to provide you with the tools that you need to be the most successful version of yourself without having to change who you inherently are. I would never want to be any different than how I am. But I know that there is value in who I am because of how my brain works. And the goal of being able to gain access to services, regardless of where you fall, is to make sure you're finding the right services to enhance who you are and to not fix or change who you are. And as I have been diagnosed again later into adulthood in my mid-30s, I've been able to gain access to tools that I wouldn't have necessarily thought were wonderful or helpful for myself. But it's also creating a way for me to learn new things about me and also be able to teach them to other people that I work with and provide supports to. And so again, like being able to understand that intersectionality of with or without the cognitive and developmental overlay is really a wonderful lens to look at that through, but is certainly, not a full stop in terms of who we are as a community.
Well, I certainly appreciate that. I'm thinking even about my own house and my own community. I think it's very interesting, the three of us on here who identify as autistic, right? All got late in life diagnoses. And in my house, we are currently undergoing a construction project where like we are repiping the entire thing from top to bottom. I think from a stimulus standpoint, that project could have been a really bad moment for me. But because my husband and I had this new knowledge, right, we were able to approach the situation from a very different preparation standpoint. And it's just a thing, right? So that knowledge of like what have members of a community learn together and grow together, people who have gone through similar things that you have gone through, that ability to kind of communicate through community, I think is incredibly important. And we get that at Anchor. That's why we get together at conference every year, right? Is communication through community. So with that in mind a little bit, we have a little bit of extra time to explore here. Jean or Janelle, did you want to jump in real quickly to expand upon these distinctions? Uh, Happy to yield that time to you.
I'll just hop in and talk a little bit about neurodiversity affirming spaces. So Heather did an excellent job of laying the land for the overlap of IDD and neurodivergence as an identity. Neurodivergence is actually a community building tool. That's what it's for. And so, with that in mind, if you think beyond what we know and what we understand about the IDD community from an industry perspective, it's very much an industry specific term. Um, but when we think about it, and we think about the overlap that does exist, and then we combine that with our understanding of more and more people getting diagnosed. Three people right here on this call are talking about how we all got diagnosed in adulthood within the last, several years, right? So we've all been working in, being a leader in mental health. We've been leaders in IDD community. We've been leaders in industry, right? And we've been right sitting next to our colleagues all this time for all these years, needing support as a neurodivergent person, but not knowing that we needed support as a neurodivergent person. And so the importance of neurodiversity affirming practices in our organizations is that we have leaders that could be cultivated even further. We have folks that have abilities that could be fostered even further if we develop neurodiversity affirming practices. And so we really push that at Bridges. I love to work with organizations to help them expand this, to help them understand this, to help them think through how they're doing this, particularly given the kinds of work that we do. We want to have value alignment. We are serving folks with higher support needs and often not doing the best at providing a neurodiversity affirming environment in our own workspaces. And that's
That's a
just
great
because
point,
things
Janelle.
change. Yeah,
Yeah,
things change over time. Where these things are shifting quickly. The CDC data that has come out for autism, for instance, right now, just this past week, we shifted from 1 in 34 to 1 in 31 in a matter of a year. And if you look at the past 7 to 10 years, you're talking about moving from 1 in 110, I believe, all the way to where we are now, 1 in 34. And for the first time ever, Black, Asian, and Latina populations, children 4 to 8, are being diagnosed, all of them being diagnosed at higher rates than their white peers. So the information is just catching up to the reality. That's all that's happening. So that's why neurodiversity affirming practices are really important.
I
to
do
build.
another presentation outside of the work that we've done for Anchor on neurodiverse hiring practices. And I think, it's interesting that the three of us are all neurodiverse and have a wide spectrum of things about us that are inherently valuable, and that we've been so successful in this space. And again, I think that we've kind of created an environment for ourselves when there wasn't necessarily a community for us to draw from. And my other presentation is really about, looking at that from the top down, from like the CEO's perspective, because what a gift that we can give to all the individuals and their families that we serve by hiring a workforce of people who are neurodiverse, who do have intellectual and developmental disabilities, to be able to walk the walk and talk the talk, because we recognize those inherent values amongst ourselves, because there is that sense of community, because
Well,
there is that level of acceptance. And while we may not have inherently had that as children or adolescents or even adults, we have inherently created that that environment for ourselves, and what is really born and kind of birthed this particular presentation. So, even looking at how we're posting jobs, and again, what types of ADA accommodations are just, again, available. Not that we have to ask for them,
yeah,
but, not that it is not a part of the company culture, but that it just is.
yeah.
Because people need a variety of different things in their work settings in order to be successful, which
So
then
Heather,
kind of
we're
follows
going to
through.
totally get to that in a
Yeah.
couple of seconds. So put a pin in that, and
Sure.
we'll definitely get back to that. And before we move on to talk about some of those values that CEOs like Jean bring to the table, Janelle, just want to make sure that that we really have the opportunity to fully embrace the question of expansion of recognizing the overlap and the distinctions between IDD and neurodivergence and creating inclusive environments. Was there anything more that you wanted to add before we ask Jean some questions about some misconceptions?
I'm pretty much summed it up for the most part. There's some things we'll dive into later that I can dig into further. The only other thing that I will add, and this is edging a little bit academic, so forgive me, but I'm a bridge builder. That's where I am. So I sit in the middle of a lot of intersections in industry, and my work is interdisciplinary. So the work that I'm doing in my PhD is really thinking through shifting policy and practice to think about neurodivergence and the neurodiversity paradigm, furthering that to extend it to culture. This is another way of being. So there's lots of good research. Dr. Damian Milton, you can look that name up and explore that. But there's lots of good research that helps us to understand that at least autistic people, but also possibly a few other folks under the neurodivergent umbrella, are experiencing not deficit at all. They're just experiencing a different way of being. It's the same thing as someone that lives in France is going to behave differently than someone that lives in the U.S. because of the way that they were raised, or because of their environment, or what have you. But for neurodivergent folks, or at least autistic folks, we're understanding that there's culture there. There's literal culture where folks are able to communicate with each other more effectively, and autistic people can communicate with each other more effectively than non-autistic, allistic people can communicate with each other. So it's really interesting stuff, but I'll leave that there of another reason why it's so important to harness the skills that neurodivergent people have, as Heather said, and to expand our understanding of what neurodiversity affirming practices can bring to our organizations.
Janelle, I really appreciate that. There's been a request for you to provide the name of the doctor you just mentioned. So if you can throw that into the chat for folks, I'm sure they'd appreciate it. So Jean, what are some of the misconceptions about how IDD and neurodivergence are viewed in the context of inclusion? And how do you think we might be able to overcome those misconceptions?
Great. So a little preface to that, because I want to hit on several points that were made already. And the first two really you brought up, Sasha. One, everyone needs to understand that people that are neurodivergent and people with disabilities are not broken. They're fully realized human beings. And we need to stop looking at deficit. That's not the perspective we should be taking. We should be looking at value and the ability that everyone has. So for people changing their minds, that's a place that I try to start with, is you need to be looking at the world differently than you're looking at. I think as you said, Heather, everyone needs a place at the table. Listen, honestly, all people do, not just neurodivergent. So when I speak, I'm speaking of inclusion broadly and from a human level, but again, specifically for the neurodiverse community, is that everyone needs to have a seat at the table. Janelle, you talked a little bit about we need more reaffirming practices. Now, I will say I love that you all are leading the way you're leading. The world is getting better, but we've got a long way to go. And if I could describe the world that I would like us to have, that I'm committed to, is a world where you don't need a diagnosis. I mean, again, you go back to it unlocks services now, but in the world that I think is a fully inclusive world, you don't need that. We've figured out how we all are being, and we figured out how to all be together. And when I think of the misconceptions, then, so let me go back to the question then specifically as I think about that. And this is in the context of my responsibility as a CEO, but it's also in the context of my responsibility as a father and a spouse, is that people need to look at the world differently. So I'll go back to the idea of being broken. I personally, in my journey, the misconception I had was that, again, it was a deficit or there was something wrong because people weren't doing it the way everyone does it. Well, for me, it's first you have to be curious and again, suspend disbelief. So when I think of it, just describing it as a father for my daughter, is that she is incredibly capable. I would not be who I am without her. She's such an incredible blessing, and she continues to teach me every day about how I need to think about the world differently. But I think the misconceptions are, let's talk about from an employment perspective, is that the perception is that they're not, someone that's neurodiverse isn't as able. That's not true. Quite frankly, I would say they're in many ways more able. So the misconception for me really is around people aren't framing the world the way they need to. They aren't looking at a human and the value the way they need to. So if we can divorce ourselves from what was the norm, and again, be curious and suspend our disbelief. So for my daughter, it's not about what can't she do or why can't she do that. It's more about, well, let's see if she can do it, and what do I need to do differently? It's not about her being broken. It's about me, and I'll personalize my journey. Although I do feel that that's the change that society needs to make, is that I have switched my framing from what's wrong with her and why can't she do it the way everyone else does it, to I can't communicate with her. I have to learn how to communicate and engage, and how do I unlock that? Because that's what we owe to everyone. So if everyone's going to have a place at the table, that's the framing that I think people need to take. So again, long answer to the misconception is that people are framing the problem wrong. They're looking at deficit or inability instead of ability, and they're not suspending their disbelief about what can be done and not being curious enough to figure out what do we need to do differently. If we're going to get the inclusive world we all deserve, we can't keep doing what's been done, because clearly we're not there yet. So how do we continually do things differently that draw people in, that allow them to be their best self, that doesn't put the onus on the individual? We create that inclusive environment. I think you used the word accessible, Heather. We create that accessible environment.
No, Gina, it makes a lot of good sense to me. As a teacher, the best piece of advice I got in my first year of teaching was that you got to meet your students where they're at. And I don't think I fully realized what that meant until I was about halfway through a approximately 20-year teaching career. I was brand new to a school, and the person I replaced was beloved and was totally different than who I was. And I sort of like fought the whole first part of the year for them to get to do what I wanted them to do. And I finally sat down one day and I just threw the syllabus and the book and the plan completely out of the water. And I turned to my students for the first time ever and I said, here's the goal. You have an hour this whole class period. You come up with the plan. How are you going to achieve this? What are you going to do to meet this goal? And you create the evaluation rubric, and I'll use all the tools that you give me to make sure that we reach this learning goal. And I kid you not, they decided to learn about immigration through music patterns, and they ended up making documentaries. That wasn't something I was ever going to bring to the table, right? And so what I loved even more was when they created that evaluation tool for themselves about, based on their success, and I used it, there was no fighting the grades because they created their own measurements and metrics. And I think why I bring that into today's conversation, right, is there's this assumption that there is one right way to do something. And I think as leaders, we often get told that the job of the leader is to create the plan versus is the job of the leader to provide the resources for the team to execute the plan for which they derive as the source of the solution. And I think that's kind of what I'm hearing from you all is that we can create a more inclusive space when we use the tools and resources we have to allow people to approach things in a different way. Before we move into that a little bit deeper, because Heather and Janelle are going to touch on that, Janelle, Heather, are there any other misconceptions that you think are out there about how IDD and neurodivergence are viewed in context of inclusion, that you'd like to kind of raise at this moment?
I think part of what this conversation is helping to alleviate preconceived notions when we use different pieces of language. And I think sometimes we get a bit jaded as being providers because we work with individuals with so many different broad spectrums of needs or diagnoses that when you close your eyes and you say, oh, I work with someone who has Down syndrome, or I work with someone who is autistic, and you think about that, you almost automatically think like, this is who this person is, right? And so like if you met myself or Sasha or Janelle or other people that we also know are on the autism spectrum or are neurodiverse, you wouldn't think that we fit that mold because you have that preconceived notion of what it means to be autistic because of someone that you met or someone's cousin or someone that we worked at the grocery store that you went to. And so from a sociological standpoint and also a language perspective, we just develop these preconceived notions about what these things are because this is what we have been taught and this is the world that we live in. And so when we close our eyes and think of what it means to be autistic or neurodiverse, I think that what Jean had mentioned also is really kind of reimagining what that means when we think of people and people who just want to be and to navigate the world. And kind of trying to make a world where we're not automatically pigeonholing people in what we believe or we preconceive of what their ability is, just based off of like who they are, how they identify.
Yeah, Sasha, I'd love to tell a quick story that illustrates the suspending disbelief and what you're describing too, Heather, is we put people in a box. I'll say we and I say I, because I'm owning this, that we put people in a box and we put boundaries around them because of preconceived notions that aren't true. I want to just quickly tell a story about one of the clients that was became an employee at Northwest Center in our assembly and packaging business. And this young gentleman's name was Chance. When he came to us, he was 18. He had multiple diagnoses. He was neurodiverse. He was on the autism spectrum. He had obsessive compulsive disorder. When Chance came to Northwest Center because he was told his whole life that he couldn't do. So he's someone who's been said, no, 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 you can't. So he came with this, well, I'm here because there's nowhere else for me to go. And I'm not capable of anything. So I'm here I am at Northwest Center. And to our assembly and packaging supervisor and manager group, to their credit, they suspended disbelief. They didn't tell Chance how to do things, but what they recognized was he has value, he has ability. We're going to put you in a role that leverages that strength that you have, not that deficit that you have. So Chance became our quality assurance supervisor for assembly and packaging. And this was for Starbucks was the customer. The product that he was queuing were gift packs that went into Starbucks stores every Christmas. And it was like a mug and coffee and some other things. So Chance was the QA manager for that. Over the course of a couple years, they shipped more than 2 million units. And using the definition of deficit or defect was if a customer returned the package, that would be considered a defect. Over 2 million units sold, 0 return. That's unheard of. That's because he had capacity and skill. So when he left Northwest Center, he left because he wanted to become a plumber. He left and became a plumber's apprentice. So he started as this individual was told, no, I can't do this. He was in an environment where disbelief was suspended. The manager said, this is what it has to look like when you're done. Use your gifts and you figure out how to make this happen. He made it happen personally and did all that. So I use that just as it's not just talking about how we do this. This is leaders like Heather and Janelle and Sasha are ensuring that this happens. And I like to think that I'm doing the same thing with my organization. This is happening. It's not being talked about that it needs to happen. It already is. And I think that's just for me a good example of this is what reminds me every day that I need to challenge my own beliefs. I need to step back. I need to be curious and say, what if?
I love that. And it also goes back to being flexible in job description and organization, right? Like you might hire somebody for one thing and realize that their superpower is something else. And do you stick yourself in the box of this is the way that things have been traditionally done? Or do you make your organization, you and that person, have a better experience by tapping into something else and being flexible in reimagining what something can look like. So I love that you're always talking about suspending disbelief, especially as like somebody who believes in like science fiction and what role that has played in the development of different communities. Maybe that's a whole nother community conversation to geek out about, where science fiction and that suspension of disbelief comes with minority groups. But in moving towards that lens, Heather, you started talking about, and I know that this is your passion, is that organizations and individuals can start now in this moment, fundamentally changing and building environments that truly support neurodivergent individuals. And including neurodivergent individuals with IDD. So, can you share with us what those people who are listening today and as part of this conversation can start today, start tomorrow, start next week in order to make sure that the workplaces that they have are more inclusive for folks?
Sure. So one of the easiest things is very simple in its practice. And it's again, actually inviting someone to the table. I've been a part of many organizations across my career, and during our time creating this presentation, Gene has shared a lot of the things that he does within his own organization. But again, making sure that the voices are represented and that we are not speaking on people's behalf. And so some of my best work has been in the realm of self-advocacy and making sure that when we're creating these opportunities for categorical change amongst our agencies, that we're inviting our own person-served individuals and our own staff members to the table when we are creating the sense of community. So, years ago, I worked for a wonderful large organization, and we were really looking at the quality of programming across a variety of different lenses and making sure that, again, that we were really inherently being a person's looking at the person served and making sure that we were doing person-centered planning, right? This buzzword that kind of came about. And I was having these moments of all these documents that I needed to create and all these forms that I needed to fill in and doing all these things in the realm of person-centered planning. But what happened often, especially with our individuals with some more categorical need, was that they were never invited to those meetings. And we were never really looking deeper into what was like historical information. And again, this is where these preconceived notions of, well, this is who this person is, this is what they're capable of, this is what their level of understanding is, this is what they're able to do from a communication standpoint. And I remember walking into a brand new day program that I was going to be overseeing, and there was 38 people there, and I would say at least 20 of them were non-speaking, and only 2 of them had augmentative devices. And so again, we really want to make sure that we're not leaving people out of the conversation simply because they don't communicate the same way that we do, simply because they're not interested in the same thing, or they maybe have the same IQ as we do. And Jean touched on this as well. And so what we did was we created a very large advocacy program. And we held elections, and we made sure that the election criteria was accessible both in written form, video form, and picture form. We brought people in to do augmentative device evaluations to find the right type of tools for people to be able to communicate. We saw a huge reduction in behavior, and then we asked them what they wanted to learn about, what they wanted to do within the programs, things that they thought were missing from the staffing perspective and the supports that they were being provided. And then from that, each of the locations we had across the entire state identified a president of each location, where we then connected with the ARCS self-advocacy program and created a whole multifunctional curriculum that was accessible to our individuals, because most of them did not even know what their rights were as a person with a disability being served at the agency, or the information we were providing them was not accessible to them. And then from that, we actually created a self-advocacy division where the individuals were coming to the meetings with the executives, with the planning teams, with the people who were in charge of what does the service delivery look like? Because who better to create the programming than the individuals themselves, and have that representation from different areas throughout the state where we lived, from individuals that they were living with, and then being able to pull off of those shared experiences to create a team of people and to create an organization that was truly representative of what they wanted from an interest perspective, from a categorical need perspective, from a from all sorts of different avenues, because they were able to speak on behalf of their peers, and that the staff members were not trying to discern what they thought was best for everyone, and that they were being able to be, again, invited to the table. This also created an opportunity from a legislative standpoint, where the individuals started to understand the different laws and different things that were impacting them from a Medicaid perspective, the threats to DSPs. And so then we were able to go to the state house and make sure that when different laws were coming out that were impacting them, that they had a seat at those tables to make sure that they were not being marginalized and that their voices were being heard as well. So, I think that when we're looking at that from an organizational standpoint, a lot of Jean's work and some of these really true leaders, these true CEOs who really understand the population that we're serving, is making sure that we are serving alongside them and that we're not serving on their behalf.
I really appreciate that. One of the first things that you were talking about is, in education, what ends up happening is you often have transition meetings where the teachers from the previous year will come in and tell you about the students you're about to engage with. I hated those meetings. I didn't want to know what your impression was of the student. Like, I'm not you. I wanted my own interaction and my own moment to figure out who these people were who were going to be entering into a learning community with me. And I think that's something really powerful that we need to consider, that people need the opportunity to grow, to change, to evolve, and also to not to go necessarily back to what Jean was talking about, suspending disbelief, but to, like, I play golf, like there's this thing called you get a mulligan, right? Where you just get to like start over. And I think that there are opportunities for us to also, maybe one of these misconceptions is we remain the same, right? That if you are an individual with an IDD or a neurodiverse, you are not going to grow and change. And we all know that that's a false statement and not something we would ever want to apply to ourselves. So why would we want to apply it to somebody else? With that in mind, though, what we're talking about in your example, Heather, is a seat at the table. I think when we lean into Janelle, the seat at the table works for the present moment, but the bigger question is, do we need the table? Who said we need the table? Who says we need the chairs? Who says that that's the world in which we should be starting to work in? And I think that leads us into the second question here in this segment of how can we ensure, Janelle, that we're creating environments that are not only accommodate neurodivergent individuals, but also celebrate their differences. And I know for you, this taps into something you were talking about earlier about we're here, we've always been here.
Y'all, I could talk about this forever, but I will not. I will say that I will say that when you think about systems and systemic change, there's a lot of approaches that you can take. You can take what we traditionally do, which is centering accommodation. So we take the system as it is and we try our best to kind of do this patchwork of here, if we do this, if we make this little shift over here, then maybe this person will be able to fit into the system as is. And the challenge with that is fundamentally at the bottom of that, the system is still constructed in a way that was not built for the neurodivergent person, for the disabled person. So fundamentally, the system was not built for us, fundamentally. So that means we're always going to be doing this like patchwork, band-aid kind of mishmash, hodgepodge thing. So one of the things that we can begin to do is systemic change is slow. So you're not going to like blow up a whole system. But one of the things that we can do is when we see chaos, when we see disruption, when we see an opportunity to make fast change, I tell people all the time, the moment that we're living in right now is that moment. Open your eyes and see what's in front of you for the opportunity that it is, and look beyond the chaos itself. When there is chaos, it tends to be an excellent opportunity to make systemic change happen more quickly and more sustainably. So if you take this kind of moment that we're kind of in right now and you think, how can we shift policy? How can we shift practice? How can we change the system so that we need less accommodation because we're building or we've shifted the system into a place where we created this system, we created this place, we created this organization with neurodivergent people in mind from the beginning. So that is kind of the premise of UD and UDL. That's Universal Design and Universal Design for Learning. Universal Design was created by Ronald Mace, actually at my alma mater and current university, NC State. It was created there. And Ronald Mace was a wheelchair user, and he came to NC State and said, this space is not working for me. And so he created Universal Design after getting his master's there, and eventually changed the world because of the work that he did. Building codes that we see now, they exist because of the work that Ronald Mace did in Universal Design. And we're seeing the same thing in Universal Design for Learning and Education, Universal Design in digital spaces and AI and accessibility there. It's made quite a wide shift over time. So what could happen? I want us to like imagine, go into a time zap or a time warp into the future in 10 years, 15 years, given the moment of chaos that we're in right now. What could happen if we said, okay, everything's getting blown up anyway? What would happen if we shifted policy to center those of us that are the most marginalized, to center those of us that have multiple disabilities, those of us that are neurodivergent? What if we built the policy and the practice from the beginning with those folks in mind? And to Heather's point, with those folks at the helm of leading that effort. That's an important part. And to Jean's point, with the humility to suspend belief and take advantage of the opportunity that's in front of us, using principles like UDL, using neurodiversity affirming practices to build new practice, to build new policy, so that we can arrive at what Jean mentioned earlier, this place where we don't have to be so heavily dependent on accommodation or on diagnosis or these things like that, because the environment is built for us in the first place.
So what you're saying is if we do all of this, basically we go from science fiction to science fact. right? That we have this ability to create reality out of fantasy. And anybody who never thought we could get to the moon, those are the things we're talking about, is if you build with a different goal in mind, you can certainly find yourself with perhaps different outcomes at the end of the day. And
Definitely, definitely. And then, in thinking beyond that, I read a cool fact today that highlighted something that I like to remind people. A lot of times folks think, oh, we're talking about neurodivergence, we're talking about neurodiversity, and we're talking about folks that are part of the IDD community. What about allistic people? What about neurotypical people? And what I like to remind people is that over and over and over again, we have all these examples through history of things that were created for the most marginalized people being of great benefit for everyone else. So today, one of my favorite content creators in the low vision and blind community shared a cool fact that I didn't know. So on Netflix, 40% of Netflix users use captions. Anybody use captions? I do. I do. Right? 40% of folks that watch Netflix use captions. Guess who captions were created for? They were created for this very small, there's not a lot of blind and low vision people in the world. There's way more neurodivergent people than there are blind and low vision people. Captions were created for blind and low vision community. And guess what? We're all out here using it, and we don't need it because we can't see, but there's lots of other reasons that we find great benefit of it, right? Um, that's just one small example. UDL has proven this over the years, over and over again. Curb cuts are not just great for wheelchair users, they're great for stroller pushers, and they're great for bike riders, and they're great for all of those kinds of things. So that's another thing that I wanted to highlight with regards to that. This is for everybody, even though you center the most marginalized person.
really appreciate that, Janelle. Um, so Jean, kind of before we get into wrapping up what's been a really incredible hour of just conversation and dialogue, um, you've given us a little bit of a common theme running throughout here about curiosity and the ability to suspend disbelief. And so, Janelle has talked about like what the room looks like when we decide to take the table out and completely redesign it, right? Heather is talking about, opening that door and making sure that people have access and are in the room. But I feel like you're giving us a world where the building hasn't been built yet. And so the room has not even come to a point of conceptualization. So, from this lens of IDD service providers who are listening today and saying, I get all of this, what do I do now to shift more into this world that, my fellow colleague Gene has been able to like begin to bring to actualization in his own organization? What are some tips that you would provide for people who are like, I'm all in, but how do I bring this concept of suspending disbelief into practice with my team and my staff? And Jean, you'll need to take your, turn your
Thank
microphone
you.
on. Of course.
So I want to build on a couple of things that were said. So how do we take this? How do we affect the change? So, being able to suspend disbelief for yourself and be curious is one thing, but I'm going to start with act. So you talked about this, we have this enormous opportunity. Let's not sit back and think about what could be. Act. The founding mothers of Northwest Center were able to do what they did and affect every zip code because they acted. They didn't set out to change the whole world, but they said, this isn't right. I'm going to lean in and do it. So the first thing is act. I think the second thing I would say, going back to the mulligan that you mentioned, Sasha, and I'll describe it as grace. Give yourself and others the grace to be wrong. Look, we got to try this stuff. Not all of it's going to work. So give yourself a mulligan, give yourself grace, try it, act. If it doesn't work, adjust, but forgive yourself if it didn't work the way you thought it did in the first place. So do those two things. I think the other thing that the approach I try to take to, and this is, I'm talking about the neurotypical audience or the abled audience when I talk about this is think about the value prop for your audience. Now, I could go out into the world and say, you need to be inclusive because it's the right thing to do. And my daughter needs a better world. So does my wife. So does my father. That's not the approach I take. You need to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I would argue in a different way than you have. You need to think about the value proposition to you. If you let the world engage and contribute, your world is going to be better. So I think part of that for me, the how do we affect that change is put yourself in the other person's position. Think about what's important to them. So we all know what's important to us. We all know the end we want to get to. But I think the way we win is let's put ourselves in front of our audience or in their space and let's craft our narrative accordingly. Because honestly, we all win when the world is inclusive, and we all lose when the world is exclusive. So let's just continue to change minds. I think that's the way that we drive that systemic change the most effectively.
You know, I think that brings two things to the front of my mind, Jean. The first one is really the lessons of design thinking, right? You create a design, you pilot it, and you learn from it. And then you create change. And then you pilot it again, and you learn from it, and you create change. You know, one of the things I look forward to every year at Anchor is, you know, we put on the conference in April, which, you know, we were very excited that like 1,300 of you like decided to join us. But we sit down for a week in May and we go through and we have conversations about from the small things to the big things about what could we do better? Like, what do we want to dream we can try? And sometimes it makes it to conference, and sometimes it like dies as an idea 3 weeks in. But you know, like there's still this opportunity to create and reevaluate. And every year we try to get better because we're not willing to walk away from an idea because we haven't done it before, right? So like, and it's that group thinking of how do we support and work with each other that I'm hearing you say is act and design, and don't expect that the first iteration of whatever you're going to do is going to be perfect. And level setting with everybody that there isn't an expectation that the first iteration of whatever you're going to do is that perfect product. So I think we have had a tremendous amount of takeaways. So as we wrap up today's conversation, I just wanted to give each one of you an opportunity to reflect on why embracing neurodivergence as an identity is really important, but more so than that, as you have listened to the conversation today, if you could identify one thing that you hope our audience takes away from the dialogue we've been engaging in, what would that be? And Jean, I hope you don't mind, but we're going to start with you. What do you think the one big takeaway is?
I'll tie it back to curiosity. What one thing did you learn today? I learned an enormous amount of things, again, just in this conversation with this group. So what's that one thing that you took away today that you didn't have when you came in? And how are you going to put that into action? So that for me, that would be, you know, for all of you that joined, you know, that would be my encouragement is that what's the one takeaway? And how am I going to bring that to life and act on it?
Heather?
So I really would love for you to take away the veil of fear. I think that oftentimes we don't know where to start. We're afraid of offending people. We're afraid of doing the wrong thing. And you know, as leaders of this particular industry, I want you to create a sense of like grace, as Jean had said, and also what your reaction to when we get it wrong will be as how you are as a leader. And so when you create that safe space for your team to fail, that is when beauty is absolutely born, because we learn from the amount of times that we've gotten it wrong. And so I think your reaction to allowing your staff to have a safe space to try and to fail and to try again is inherently valuable in how we learn. And so making sure that we're creating that space to make sure that we try and we try again, like the little engine that could, I think I can, I think I can, because that is where those things are born. And as Janelle mentioned, we are in a very intricate part in our history of what the future of our world will look like for people like Jean's daughter, like myself and Sasha and Janelle, and for all of those who come after us. And so I also want you to take away like what you want your stamp on this to be, and how you want to be remembered and how you reacted to where we are at in history, and how you're going to move forward and create this world, because it begins with a single step. And again, change can be small, but it can also have such a snowball effect of how we continue to change the world that we know.
You know, Heather, I'd like to follow up on that for a second. So I think in a lot of leadership circles, right, and in different generations, leaders are taught that they're not allowed to be publicly vulnerable, that they're not allowed to admit that they have messed up or made mistakes, or as that will impact their power position. And so, to leaders who have been brought up into that mind frame of thinking that you are not supposed to be vulnerable, what does modeling vulnerability mean for staff who are trying to do exactly what you said, try, but fear the failure? How do leaders address those two things? Like, how do they overcome that fear of vulnerability?
You know, I certainly think that it again starts with a single step and kind of humanize us, as leaders. Again, some of my proudest moments as a leader have been in those moments of vulnerability of, again, we are just like everyone else and we make mistakes. And I think that that creates a sense of strength among your team members to know that while our role is to lead the organization, it is not to do everything, and that we are all not inherently good at everything, regardless of our disabilities or our abilities. And that is not our role as leaders. Our role as a leader is not to be great at everything. It's to create a space for everybody to create a collective. And when you are open enough to admit when you are not good at something, and smart enough to know that you hire in your pockets of things that you need to enhance about yourself and what you are not inherently good about, it creates a sense of vulnerability to create that level of trust among your team. And again, like makes you look like a human. And I think that sometimes we don't want to be vulnerable because vulnerability is a perceived weakness. But again, that is just the norm, right? You know, Jean talks about this and Janelle talks about this of just, again, creating a sense of change just among the entire industry. And that starts with our leaders. And just because it hasn't been trendy or acceptable doesn't mean that we can't be the first person to take the first step to create a sense of vulnerability and transparency really is what it is, you know, among our team members to make sure that if we're expecting that of them, that we have to model that within ourselves.
Absolutely. Thank you. Janelle, what about you? What's your key takeaway you want this audience to carry with them today?
Wow. Well, well, before that, I want to say thank you. Thank you, Sasha. Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Heather. This has been an awesome conversation. I've loved being a part of it, love being a member of this panel. So I would say that my primary takeaway for everyone is to number one, lean into community. That these are things that are more common than we realize. Folks are facing challenges in their personal lives with their own selves and their own minds and development, but also with their family members that we may not know about or we may know very little about. And we begin to dispel pseudoscience and false beliefs when we own who we are and where we are and how we are in our difference. And so, to our point, there's three folks on this panel who have been working in different places in industry as undiagnosed people. And so I'm willing to bet that there are folks on this call who may be undiagnosed people. I'm willing to bet that there's folks who have differences that they've been asking themselves, or their children or their grandchildren got diagnosed, and now they're asking, like, hey, like, well, I didn't think about this. Like, what if it's me too? So I encourage you to lean into community, and also in the midst of that, lean into anti-ableist work, anti-ableist practices. At the end of the day, if we keep living long enough, we will become disabled. So you may not be autistic, or you may not be an ADHD, or you may not have Down syndrome, but if you keep living long enough, you will join the disability community. So we might as well move away from the perspective that, you know, this difference or this other, or no, this is about all of us. It's in a matter of time, it will be about all of us. And that will help us to do things like suspend belief, and to be vulnerable, and to begin moving towards the work to actually act, recognizing that we all have a role to play, and that we are all members of this disability community, whether we are right now in our existence, or whether we will be, or whether we love someone who is.
Appreciate that. So we do have 2 questions from the audience, and folks, if you have more, please go ahead and put them into the Q&A section. We do have about 15 minutes here. So the very first one, I think, is a lovely question, which is, what positive, affirming, neurospicy dialogue would you recommend for informing a newly diagnosed teenager? And I just love this question, particularly what I did not reveal is my mom is an autism specialist. And when I got my diagnosis later in life, I called her up and I was like, I'm confused. Like, why didn't you tell me this? She's like, our relationship when you were a teenager was difficult enough. You think I was going to be the one to tell you? So there's definitely different ways to dialogue and get involved. So with that in mind, anybody want to take that question about what positive, affirming, neurospicy dialogue we can help teenagers who are newly diagnosed? Maybe Heather, we start with you, the mom of, what is it, 5 children? It sounds like you've probably had this conversation on more than one occasion.
Yeah, I think it starts early about teaching our children how people are inherently different. Again, like, children only have access to the information that we provide them. And so you will find my children seeking out play partners who are completely nonverbal at the same rate that they do with children who are probably more neurotypical, just because we highlight the differences and not the deficits of what we look for in potential partners or potential people that we want to befriend. I think it's also, again, making sure that we're looking at that level of inclusivity, and that you're not different, or you're not like disabled necessarily, or that there's no negative connotation to this, and like what your superpowers are, or what makes you, uniquely you. I also think that this is a lens of what this looks like from a social standpoint, whether because of their level of being in school, and things of that nature. So, making sure that they help them find their people. Again, like I've been able to find my people, and how, looking for social skills groups, or different things where you're able to help them develop that sense of community that they may be seeking early on. But again, also just, having children, I'm also very transparent about what makes me wonderful, but also what I really struggle with. And so, like, I have opportunities to connect with my daughter, like, again, when I'm not getting it right as a mom, and I'm overstimulated, or I don't have any more patience left, or I've forgotten to take one of my medications for ADHD, and so I think that, when we are vulnerable with our own children, they see us not only as parents, but also as people that are inherently flawed also, and that sometimes we don't get it right. And just being transparent enough to let them know that, we've made mistakes, and that we are also there, and that we also see connectivity with them. While my children are all adopted, there are things that I think that we inherit from one another through osmosis in some way, that nature nurture complex. And so again, just being sure that we're teaching inclusivity, we're teaching differences and not deficits, and that we're helping our children find their community, and actualizing what's wonderful about themselves and what's wonderful about that diagnosis as well.
Jean, Dad, what would you give as advice to these teenagers?
That's to me.
Yeah.
Just making sure. Again, I think really well articulated, Heather. I think for me, I would just continue to reinforce two things: the celebrating differences. So you're valuable, you're extraordinary, and you're gifted, and try to build up the self-worth in the individual. So reminding them that because they are. I think the other thing that you touched on, Heather, for me was that um, don't approach the world the way the world approaches you. Approach the world the way we want the world to approach us. And so encourage them to be brave and be strong and to reach out. Like you said, with your kids, they'll reach out to kids that are nonverbal as much or more than they would neurotypical. So I think it's trying to get them grounded into, for me, it's like, I'm your biggest fan. You're a wonderful human being. It's a hard journey, but lean in and demonstrate, this is, treat others how you want to be treated is the way I would describe it.
Janelle, we've got another question here. It says, do you find it helpful to highlight how accessibility also benefits neurotypical individuals when advocating for more inclusive environments?
Sure. Well, before that, I wanted to tap into the other question. I'm a family therapist, so I do this like all the time. But I
Yes.
will say that for folks that are having trouble navigating those conversations, that's what therapy can help with. A lot of times families are struggling to have these conversations. They don't know what to say. They don't know how to manage it. Their children, their teenagers are struggling with the news or struggling with the diagnosis. And every teenager is different based on what's going on with them, based on their environment, based on the way they were raised. Their belief systems, they might not have been part of households like Heather's or Jean's, where they witnessed disability being celebrated, and that is part of the challenges that they're facing in embracing the diagnosis. So there's lots of nuance there. If it's hard or if it's challenging, get professional help. We're really good at it, especially a family therapist. We do this kind of stuff all the time. So I'll throw that out there. Now, with regards to the question about
Benefits for pointing out benefits to neurotypical individuals when advocating for more inclusive environments.
right. Thank you for repeating that question for me.
No worries.
So I think it goes back to a little bit of what Jean hinted to earlier about how you present the information, how you make the proposition. So pay attention to who your audience is and how they are and what they care about and what they need. And you fashion the message to the audience to some degree. This is really important because a lot of times for those of us who are really passionate about the disability community, and we're passionate about those of us who we either have diagnoses ourselves or we know and love people who have diagnoses, that passion can be difficult to translate to help others that are interested in making change, but maybe kind of on the fence. It can be difficult to translate that passion into action. And one of the best ways to do that is to really evaluate the leader, really evaluate the organization, really get into the nitty gritty of what is the problem that they're facing. And then how can what I provide or what I am advocating for as far as neurodiversity affirming practices, how can that help them make change in that area that is a problem spot for them? The other thing is using relatable stories. You know how I told y'all about the story about, or the statistics about Netflix and how there was all this, like, all these hearts flew everywhere, right? You can do the same thing. take practical examples, tell people, help them to really see like how this is relevant to everyone, and it's not just relevant to neurodivergent folks or disabled folks.
So we've got enough time for, I think, this last question that I'd love to throw out to you all, which is coming into the chat, which is, where would you recommend families with neurodivergent young adults with autism to start when looking for inclusive job opportunities?
I would love to touch on this. So I have spent the latter part of my career as very immersed in the world of employment services. And I think providers like Gene or your local VR offices are a wonderful place to start. Or even for younger teenagers who are still in high school looking at pre-employment transition services programs or IDD-centric or neurodiverse-centric grant-funded opportunities that are often offered through the agencies that are in your local community. I would start by talking to your local child study team about different opportunities and also just become very well connected to your local VR offices and the local voc rehab counselor programs. Those are really going to help you navigating your journey through transition opportunities for things like high school into adulthood or even into intercollegiate opportunities where you're looking for opportunities for supports if your children choose to go to college and have other types of trades. And just making sure that the world is accessible to them. Also making sure that they have a wide variety of opportunity. A lot of times when we look at opportunities through pre-employment transition services or VR, they're often pigeonholed into kind of the holy trinity of different types of jobs, which are like customer service and sanitation related. And there is so much more out there, especially when you're looking at a broad spectrum of ability and also interest. Um, I'm actually doing a tremendous amount of research right now in the realm of artificial intelligence and HIPAA compliance. And we're also looking at how this relates to the world of employment services. And so I would, have you kind of maybe take a look at things like ChatGPT or other forms of HIPAA compliant artificial intelligence, because then you can plug in your loved one's interests, their level of comfortability with transportation, and also marry that to businesses in your local area that have neurodiverse hiring practices that may be accessible with relationship to how they choose to get to and from work, or also have a wide variety of spectrum of supports within those different types of places. I ran these through our own HIPAA compliant AI assistants through the agency, through Setworks, through the company that I work for, and oftentimes it's giving me places that I have very successfully placed individuals at, and also additional ones that I didn't even think of, even having been a provider for the last 20 years. So I just think, being able to measure where your loved one is at in their journey from their age, and starting early to make sure they just have a lot of opportunity to try a lot of different things so that when they become an adult, they really have kind of parsed out things that are not in their level of interest, and that they have kind of an avenue like we all would have. I mean, like we all would have gone through different types of interest-based things as early learners and high school students and internships. And so taking those types of practices that we maybe have experienced in our own way and reimagining them in a way that's more accessible for your loved one.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. If you are not aware, one of the superpowers of generally autistic humans is that we find deep love and passion for very specific things. And one thing I would share with you that is my deep love and passion that I would consider if you have younger children is really be deliberate about the picture books and storybooks that you choose to bring home from the library. In the last 10 years, the diversity of these early starter narratives has just grown to tremendous lengths. And there's lots of tales that start by teaching our young people that being different is not a deficit. So if you're interested in any of those, hit me up on LinkedIn. That's my geek out life, is reading children's books. So happy to share that knowledge with you, but so happy today to have Jean and Heather and Janelle join us. Our next big event will be the week of May 12th, where we will be rolling out Anchor Connect's greatest hits. So if you joined us in San Diego, all of that is free to you. And if not, make sure to check out our educational offerings so that you can take away some of the best practices that came out of this year's conference. We're really excited to share that a number of those come from self-advocates. So again, happy to have you all here. Happy that you continue to engage in these really challenging and complex questions and environments. And to those of you who are asking us today, what can we do as a community for things that are upsetting and harmful to us that are coming out from a policy perspective? I know my lane, folks. So what I'm going to tell you is you pay attention to what's going on with Anchor's fantastic GR team, and they will keep you in the loop with all the ways that you can advocate for those accepting supports and services and those yourself. So thank you. We appreciate you and look forward to hearing your feedback from the survey next week, as well as getting you this recording. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jean. Thanks, Heather. Thanks, Janelle. Have a great day.